In this video, we hear from Robert Albach, an industrial security expert. Corporate acquisitions are commonplace in the energy industry, so understanding how to establish a secure transition of infrastructure is vital. Here's Robert to give us some guidance.
Howdy, folks. Just a little indigenous greeting there from Texas. Robert Albach, down in Austin, Texas. I've been here most of my life. I've got a couple of responsibilities here in Cisco. I've got an explicit role detecting threats and traffic of interest through the firewall, and there's a thing called Snort for those of you who've been involved in secure for some time. I'm the product manager for Snort. My night job, hence the black background, is industrial security. So I just got back from Hannover Messe, which is like the world's largest manufacturing event in Germany last week. My involvement in what I'll describe as the petrochemical industry is multifaceted. I used to do surveys in South Texas, basically doing well site locations. So basically running around with a machete, hacking through the mesquite and finding exactly where the site's supposed to go. My brother worked for Western GECO / Schlumberger, South Atlantic, Stavanger, North Sea, basically on a boat for 3 months at a time doing well logging. My wife is a chemical engineer, and her father-in-law built chemical plants up and down the Gulf Coast and in Europe as well. So every which way I turn, there's just oil and gas all around us, just partially because I live here in Texas. So what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that there's a lot of dynamism in the industry, and that can have an impact on the security stance of the assets that you're dealing with. This presentation is way too short. So I also want to thank Louis then for actually giving me some extra time in this respect. So thanks, Louis. But it's going to be very incomplete. I'm going to acknowledge that right up front. But also note in the lower left of this title slide, that's my email address. So folks, if you've got concerns or questions about anything that I bring up today, then I would just be honored if you were to reach out to me directly. Or if you're feeling shy, just go to Roland and he'll get in touch with me as well. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. All right, so I am old school security. It is people first, process second, technology is the last thing. The point being, if you don't have the right people doing the right things, if you don't have an organization which is applying the right processes, then in fact, frankly, all the technology in the world isn't going to help you, possibly even make things worse. But one of the things that we're really kind of thinking about here and driving this particular discussion is recognizing the market itself and how that impacts the roles of different people, what is it they're trying to do, and the different organizations and what they're in a position to act on. So just a few little data points. Just Colorado itself, not a tier 1 site, but over the last 5 years, there's over 42,000 oil and gas leases which were bought and sold. All right, so the point being, somebody owns something at some point in time that now it's somebody else, and then we move on. I'm in Austin, Texas. I mentioned not really a oil and gas headquarters for Austin so much, although there's quite a few software firms here dealing with it. But there's a lot of lawyers here. And so lease transmission, who owns what, that seems to happen a lot here in Austin. Maybe it's because it's the state capital. But one of the things that changes a lot are pipelines. So you'll note here that we've got different pipeline miles are constantly going up, right? Primarily it's natural gas growth for the most part, but the number of operators is going down. So in short, some things are getting turned over, a lot of things going out. A lot of folks are in business one moment, out of business the next. So again, it's a very dynamic environment, and this dynamism, things that are changing basically represent exposures, or at least potential exposures from the security perspective. Some of these changes are visible from space. So what you've got here is a nighttime view, note my black background, of Texas itself. You see Austin at the top, San Antonio, Corpus Christi, and all of that swath there is your Eagle Ford Shale. Now, I've lived in Texas for about 50 some odd years, and I can tell you those aren't towns. Those are basically methane flares. So my joke is that if I'm driving home at night, home being deep South Texas, once I get to that area there, I can just turn my lights off because the roadways are lit up by all these flaring activities that are just right on the side next to it. Now, you go a little farther south from the Eagle Ford and you get to an area called Fremont, and you'll hit the rig, which hasn't shown a movie in about 30 years because what used to look like the Eagle Ford Shale in South Texas area more or less collapsed. There's actually an entire refinery, gas refinery, just outside of Fremont, which has been shut down for decades there as well. So things change, and all that infrastructure is up and humming at one moment, and then it's gone the next. And that can represent a good number of challenges there. There's a lot of also mobile assets that are out there. So off of the coast of South America right now, you have this nice floating production rig that's going out there, and Lord only knows where that Schlumberger truck is, but I've certainly been run off the road more than once by some of these things just barreling down a farm to market in Texas. But these things are all connected, and they have to be connected, and they're going to operate in different localities with different laws, different connectivity providers, and all of these things represent some significant challenges. Now, we always want to focus on this kind of sophisticated equipment that's out there in the patch doing whatever it's going to be doing. But I'm going to talk a little bit because it's a security discussion. So we're inevitably going to have to talk about bad people doing bad things or people making mistakes. And so we'll give a couple examples of some cybersecurity incidents. And none of them are going to be exactly what you might think. So let's talk a little bit about 2018. And so some of you may or may not be aware, but there were at least 4 gas pipelines that got shut down in 2018. And this was an actual cyber attack. And if you take a look at these headlines, right? Insecure SCADA systems blamed in rash of pipeline data network attacks. Absolutely wrong. In no form or fashion does any of this involve any kind of SCADA system. Cyber attack pings data systems, at least 4 gas networks. I can't tell you how many people reached out to me, say, Robert, tell me about this ping attack. No, there was no ping. It just happened to be a unfortunate word choice involved here. And the last one from the Midland Republic Times actually gets it right. Cyber attack shuts Energy Transfer's pipeline data system. That was the cause. What actually happened here was that there is an EDI provider working between the pipelines and the consumers of this natural gas. These are natural gas pipelines, actually. And it was their cloud-based electronic data exchange that was actually hit. This was a subcontractor to the data exchange entity. So the real, and actually in some ways more concerning headline would have been attack on cloud system shuts down gas pipelines. Not the kind of headline anyone would really expect. But the lesson here is if you're picking up assets from somebody or you're buying a pipeline or whatever the case might be, you can't limit your view of what makes the system work to what's just within the control of that vendor. You need to think loud and wide. What is the end-to-end value chain for whatever set of assets you're selling and or potentially purchasing? going forward, and consider that as your boundaries, because in effect, there are no boundaries. I mean, there are certainly, if you're involved in it, and certainly your attackers don't really care what your org chart looks like or which particular domain your email goes to. If they can impact it, they will. So that's just one statement to understand here. Malware, and malware is the attack. People, generally speaking, it is incredibly rare, as in like hasn't really been confirmed for the last 5 years, that anyone is directly attacking an industrial control system. In this particular case, the United States, and this is an interesting case just because why is this coming from the Coast Guard? The Coast Guard is responsible for docking facilities and such. So in the case where there's going to be some, again, petroleum products being shipped abroad, they're going on to these big tankers, maybe they're hanging off in the loop, maybe they're at Freeport, Corpus, wherever the case may be. There was some malware that actually hit the port and thus ceased some transfer operations onto these things. Now, it didn't last very long, but the point was it was garden variety malware, the same kind of thing that might hit your local kindergarten or whatever the case might be. It doesn't take any kind of particular sophistication, again, to make outages happen. And then, of course, we've got the Great Colonial Pipeline example, which people, again, don't get right time and time again. They focus as a pipeline. It must be about pipeline controls. No, it was only about billing. The billing system on the IT business side was impacted. And again, attackers don't care what your org chart looks like. If they can impact it, they can impact it. And this is just simply the case that Colonial wasn't going to ship anything anymore if they couldn't build them properly. So think of all of the assets involved in this value chain discussion as being relevant to your discussion regarding do we or do we not have a secure set of assets in play. Now, those are just sort of the counterintuitive examples. Let's get a little bit more on the, well, what should we really look at in these places? And I'm going to focus because, again, this is way too broad, primarily on your asset and your control asset sides here for a moment. Things that we've gotten involved in, that I've been involved in it during mergers, and this is not in any way unique to the industrial space, is how do you combine the assets, the compute assets, in a secure fashion between two organizations that are being merged and or one consuming the other. There are transactions that have to take place. And one of the means that people will do these things is that they will duplicate their transactions so that the entity being acquired will continue to have their interactions with their customers and their suppliers as they normally do, but they'll create duplicate entries which will go through an electronic data interchange space. And that way, the organization which will be doing the acquisition will actually have some history of these things before you actually try to merge the actual transactional software in place. Right? So maybe someone's using SAP, someone else is using Oracle Business or something like that, and eventually you're going to have to do these things, but you want to have transaction to what's happening, what's these things that are happening there. So sometimes EDI is the way they'll do it. Now, I just mentioned an attack on EDI as being problematic. This is why we're actually mentioning it here as well. Now, at some point, you're going to have to start to merge parts of the networks, and you want to make sure that you've got some well-defined boundaries in place. There is, for any organization, Cisco and anybody else, there is a DMZ, or for those of you who are overseas, a DMZ, which defines the boundary between your business and the rest of the world. Similarly, there should be an industrial DMZ, IDMZ, to separate the business from the operational assets here as well. Okay, this will be the second set of things that are going on, but you may be wanting to merge those between your the one being acquired and whatever. There needs to be that IDMZ also there. Okay. And the other thing that you want to consider is the contractual obligations and dependencies that are out there that, again, we're talking about communications here. Who is your service providers for the entity being acquired? How does that merge with the sets that you're already using? Gee, is everybody doing, site-to-site microwave, or are we doing satellites, whatever the case might be? You've got to get some inventory on what are all the vectors by which external entities or whomever will communicate inward to these critical assets. So these are just things that are largely paper exercises, but they're just places that you need to start looking at. We've then got a different set of inventories at play. And this is going to be valuable for both buyers and sellers, meaning if I can represent to a potential buyer that I have a full inventory of all of the assets that are out there, what's the equipment, what's the software that's being run, the status of those licenses even, and such, right? Because if the license is about to expire and I don't update it, I may potentially have an operational gap, things along these lines. But here's the inventories that I want to highlight in effectively a priority order. The first thing is the human identities. Who are the people who have access and the rights to take action on the assets that we're potentially going to sell to somebody? These are things that are very important because there's always this question at times of who can do what. And this will map sometimes into potentially problematic issues of we're buying this entity, but not everybody's going to have a job when this deal closes. So it's going to be very important to understand, who are the people who are actually having access rights and such, because some folks you may need to cut off a little early, depending upon when these things happen. So identity on the network, who has access to what, that's a very important piece. Network identity, what does your network maps look like? How might you do these things? Things that you can do pretty quickly if you've got reasonably modern equipment, like Cisco offers, particularly in that industrial form. You can enable flow data, flow capture, and you can now see at a high level what's talking to what. That gives you an upside view. It also gives you an opportunity to best understand where you're going to place some more detailed visibility tools farther down that site. Site identities. This can be a little silly at times, as in, well, where on earth are these things actually sitting? Different geographies will have different telecom providers. Those are important things to know. I've seen a lot of confusion, particularly in pipeline states where someone acquired a provider who had pipeline facilities in the exact same town, and they just so happen to use the same identifiers for those particular sites, and which caused a little bit of entertaining confusion at there. So, where are these things? And I want to emphasize the concept of a system. Systems and what all of their touches are and dependencies are really important to understand. So if this is a pumping station, then we need to know that that's a pumping station and it's not a production platform, and so forth. Because how we treat those is going to be a little bit differently. Sometimes you're only buying the transport system and not the production platform, or maybe you're buying the universe, right? I'm buying the production stuff, but I'm not necessarily buying the transport. So again, what's what and how do these things relate? That's going to be important. And then at some point, you are going to want to know exactly what are the details, what is that HMI on the vibration control. You'll then recognize that, hey, this is really ancient stuff. There may be a fairly significant investment in modernizing things. That's going to be necessary. How do we do that? Well, we've got a lot of tools that have been mentioned earlier as well. But again, inventory is very important. What is it that we're about to buy? And what's the state of these things that we're about to buy? But you're going to have to work your way down, because some of these things, more than once, you've had unhappy employees who know they're about to become former employees take some actions that you didn't want them to do. There's an explicit case that happened in Louisiana, actually, in a scenario such as this. Okay, one of the outcomes of that colonial event was this entity TSA, whom we know and love from the airports, being told, hey, guess what? You're in charge of pipelines. Why? Because we're transporting things. What are we doing? Well, we're transporting petroleum products and other things across state lines, et cetera, et cetera. And they just said, got it, we'll go after it. They got it, they went after it. Can't say they did a particularly good job. You have to think, what was their stimulus? Well, okay, it was the Colonial Pipeline incident. Well, what did they do? Well, they went in, properly identified, well, the problem was in the billing department. Improperly, unfortunately, they took the best practices for addressing that billing breach and apply them to the entire company without knowledge of understanding, well, does this work down at this pump station? So let's give some examples here. This particular case, look, we have to get all of your patches up to date. There's like a really aggressive date times of this. For Cisco, hey, good news. And we fully recognize, by the way, going to the absolute latest patch is not necessarily the right thing. So even at Cisco, we have a recommended release, which is not, in fact, it's never the latest release. We have a latest release, and then our recommended release says, here's the one that's proven itself over time. It's got the majority of security concerns and, critical patches that are in place, but it's one that's shown over a period of typically at least 3 months that its deployment has been stable and customers are most likely to exceed with that. What that means is TSA Directive 2B2-G, Cisco itself does not recommend that you go immediately to the highest and latest patch necessarily. We have that recommended release. Thus, we can provide that here's why you don't want to do this, because Cisco itself has said, here's the recommended patch. Now, you'll see below that a story about Rockwell Automation. This is actually from Rockwell's own self. There was an update by Microsoft to their Windows platforms in DCOM, which installed a hardening patch, which basically said, look, there's a lot of very poor security practices around DCOM, and we're going to force these DCOM patches to go out. That broke a lot of Rockwell Automation stuff. They were forced with the question of, do I maintain my current state of up-to-date patches, or do I continue to run? The answer is you continue to run. But you have to document these things. And so having that inventory and being able to map that inventory state to what is a reasonable version of software to run is part of this TSA regulatory pieces. So if you're dealing, again, with pipelines, this is something that you have to be prepared to deal with. Again, for Cisco, we're helpful with that for their own equipment. Here's what you should be running. Here's what the recommended is, and here's why. But this is something that you need to consider, and it's something that could come out. Again, dynamic environments. What did I just buy? Is it up to date? Why is it not up to date? Should we do something about it, or do we need to ask for a deferral? Okay, these are just things to basically understand. Things get a little more interesting when we talk about data retention. Particularly if you're getting data from somebody else that you're buying, or if you're selling something. If you have up-to-date data retention policies, you're in much better shape. But what's going to drive those things? Some of these can be asset value. Sometimes there's operational environmental data. There may be incident reporting that's at play. And again, various venues and different legislative regulatory drivers are at play there. And then there's security incident reporting. There can be a perceived liability of holding on to this data. So in South America, there is a French entity. This is something I recently learned, that the country of France, the longest shared border that France has is with Brazil, not with the European countries. So that means some of the EU constructs and privacy controls might be at play down there in French Guiana. So that's something you need to be aware of. And thus, being able to identify individuals and such may be the kind of data set that you can't hold on to, or at least you're going to necessarily potentially have to alter these things. And do you potentially have other non-employee records? And might you be inheriting some of these things? If you get that data, if someone needs to be able to understand what is it we've just captured and what's our potential liability for having it. All right, so this is an important thing. So one of the things I'm responsible for is the fact that our firewalls can actually decrypt traffic that goes across it. Some folks will not decrypt that traffic because of what they might find in it. And if I found it and it's now in my records and logs, I have to apply a whole nother layer of security and provenance to that I wouldn't normally do. So these are things that you might want to think about when you are either buying or selling your assets and the data that goes with it. So here's just a few things to understand. This is out of the US tax code. As I said, I know a lot of lawyers here in Austin that deal with oil and gas. One of their favorite things is, hey, you've got to understand what the lifespan is expected in these types of assets. And it varies according, not just, oh, it's this company. No, it's what class of assets am I dealing with here? And then how long do I actually have to maintain some of this information about, I bought this at this point in time, here's how much that costs, and so forth and so on. Now, if you're under the EPA's control, you may have up to 5 years that you may have to keep. Now, I will tell you, there is a good amount of some legal activity going on in West Texas having to do with some less than healthy mud contents that get spilled out into different environments. A lot of salt getting distributed across the land, making it effectively unfarmable. Not that you can do a whole lot of farming in West Texas, but at least around Pecos, you can get some pretty nice cantaloupes up there. I used to pack cantaloupes, but basically it can make a difference. So you've got 5 years worth of record keeping that needs to be there. So if you're buying a group that might have some potential environmental issues, you want to make sure that that record keeping is available to you. And similarly, if you're selling it, got to make sure that you've maintained that. If you do need to destroy data, you have to be careful as to what data you do destroy and such. There are guidelines specifically about that. NIST publication 800-88, guidelines for media sanitation. How do you prove that you have actually destroyed data that you're not supposed to be hanging on to or wishing to dispute? These all are some very bit of tangential security concerns, but they're very real. Policies and controls. How under control are the assets, primarily the compute network assets that are in place? I don't want to say policies are worthless, but pieces of paper are pieces of paper and they're worth whatever the weight of that paper and ink is, unless they're actually put into practice. So don't confuse policies with the controls. They may have some statements with regards to here's what our policies are, but every policy should be manifest and demonstrable in the tools that determine network access, network participation, and things of that nature. Do we allow third-party folks to dial directly in from the outside, directly to an asset, with a refinery? True or false? Are there vibration control systems that we've got in play with 3G LTE modems that go directly to a service provider where someone can gain access without us ever knowing about it? Take a look at those DMZ/IDMZ rules and logs, largely just firewall rules. You should ask for a copy of that, as soon as you can, because we're going to potentially merge those things at some point. Their policies for exchanging information, again, potentially through EDI, who's that EDI provider, people that they're selling to or potentially buying from. And then look at the identity controls. Again, we talked about, who's who. Am I using TACACS? Am I using Active Directory? What do those structures look like? And so forth. And then just the usual network NAT control, network access control, and then even down to application controls that are there. But you're going to want to work your way top down, and you really want to ensure that it's not just a written policy, but it can be demonstrated within the controls themselves. Now, finally, we do have product in play here. So our big story here for Cisco is, from that HMI on that vibration controller, the sensor there, all the way up potentially to your cloud and your EDI exchange, Cisco is making those connections, right? We've got the industrial kit, which connects to that sensor. We've got a presence in the cloud. We can make that connection. We can have visibility in those connections. And we've got tools that can gain visibility out of it and apply policy top to bottom. So here's just a list of the pieces that we've got here. Cybervision, Bob mentioned, that's the piece that really understands what's happening at that at those control layers and such, and what's happening. That plugs into our identity services engine, our firewalls to actually implement controls, Duo, multi-factor authentication. The point being is we don't have any gaps, and we don't want our customers to have any gaps either.
That was Robert Albach, who walked us through a way of thinking about security that goes much broader than the traditional IT or OT approach. You can jump right into the next session of our Virtual Energy Summit by clicking on the next video. Take care.